Hi there, and welcome to our final review here in um, our English 3U class. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be with you because we are experiencing severe winter weather. Um, we got about half an inch of ice, so we are experiencing power outages. So I'm going to do my best to make sure that you get everything that you need out of this session. And again, this is our final review session. So I'm so sorry that I can't be with you on our final course. But hopefully, you have enjoyed your time with me over these past few weeks. And by few, I mean we've had quite a few weeks together. So without further ado, let's get into what we're talking about. We have been obviously reviewing our lessons since the very first class. And so we're going to continue our review of the major points from our previous lesson. So let's get into it. All right. So Elizabethan dramas. We spent a lot of time on Elizabethan dramas, as in particular Macbeth. So Elizabethan drama refers to the vibrant English theater. It occurred between 1558 and 1603, but sometimes it's extended to 1642. But anyway, it's a golden age marked by iconic playwrights by William Shakespeare, which we've read obviously from Macbeth, but we've also looked at clips from Hamlet. He has so many, and we're going to get into Shakespeare a little bit later. Christopher Marlowe is another Elizabethan drama artist. Um, famous open air theaters like the Globe and complex plays that mix tragedy, comedy, and history. They explore human nature, power, love, and love for diverse audiences from everywhere from, lower echelon to nobility. And so this period saw the development of professional acting troupes like the Shakespeare Company, innovative staging back then. You're talking about 15th century, you're talking about trapdoors, balconies, things that just were unheard of, elaborate costumes, and influential plays that move beyond religious themes to focus on secular human concerns. And so we learned this. We also saw this again, obviously, in Macbeth, the Scottish play. And so in the Elizabeth and early Stuart period, the theater was the focal point of the age. Theater was all the rage. It was all the things, all, and I mean all the things, right? Public life was shot through um, with theatricality, right? It was very much like everything was over the top. Monarchs ruled with a lot of pageantry, a lot of it had to do with the rank and status, and so a lot of that was also defined in a rigid code of dress, how you appeared, and so while on the stage, the tensions and contradictions working to change the nation were embodied and played out. And so a lot of what happened in culture was reflected, or the way they wanted culture and things to go in their time were reflected in stage plays, in theater. And so more than any other form, the drama itself, um, whatever whatever the play was about, it addressed the total experience of society. That is how um, impactful Elizabethan dramas were. And so let's get into obviously our favorite. We spent, like I said, a lot of time on Macbeth, and I know we probably beat this thing to a pulp. We beat this thing to a pulp, and unfortunately, I know. And so let's get into Macbeth. We know that with Macbeth, it was a historical thriller, right? People have different interpretations and reflections on the different categories and different things that Macbeth, that Shakespeare touches on with this particular play. But we know that it was a historical thriller. It kept us on the edge of our seat, but it's also historical in context because it's based off of first century Scotland and what happened. We know that Macbeth himself was a real king. He really did exist in first century Scotland. So when Shakespeare wrote about it in 14th, 15th century, it has some historical context. And so there's a lot of illusion in Macbeth. Now, one of the things that can be argued is that Shakespeare delves into some psychology with how he treats some of the characters, and we did see that. We saw a lot of, times when Macbeth and even Lady Macbeth thought they were hearing things or seeing things, right? That they thought that they were going crazy, and had moments. They dealt with. They had insomnia, which is a psychological thing, because of guilt. And so psychology plays a big role in Shakespeare's Macbeth, as well as it being a thematic play. We see several themes that we've discussed throughout this play. Undoubtedly, it is political. How do we know that it is political? First of all, it starts with a monarchy in at war, and so anytime you're dealing with any type of monarchy rule, it is political, right? And so we're it's at war. This is a benevolent king, King Macbeth himself, the original king, as well as in this play, was a benevolent king. People liked him, and all was right with the kingdom, and so that is political. Um, and it is a tragedy based off of, we can see everything that happens in this play. It is a tragedy, and we're going to look at the definition based off of what Aristotle says a little bit later, and how Aristotle defines a tragedy. But yes, it is a tragedy. And so we definitely spent extensive time going over the play. It is difficult to read. We read it together. We've seen some different clips of it, from film adaptations to theater, and so we had a good run with it. And we concluded with Macbeth Bingo. And the reason I did that was, again, so that you can see how much you have in common with the play. And that's another way for you to insert your voice into the conversation surrounding Elizabethan dramas. And I know that this particular lesson was difficult because Elizabethan dramas, in particular, are meant to draw you in emotionally. And that is outside the norm for you. When it comes to learning, it's not something that you can memorize. It's something that you just have to experience and work through. And so we can see all of these different interpretations of Macbeth, the historical thriller, the illusions, the psychological drama, the fact that there were so many different things that we will be able to pull out of it, the politics and the tragedy. And so that is our quick overview of a little bit of, getting started with our overview of Macbeth. Now, let's get more into, again, who Macbeth was, how this play came about. It's written, obviously, by William Shakespeare, one of the premier Elizabethan drama artists. And he was not only a playwright, but he was also a poet. And he was born in 15th century Scotland in a place called Stratford upon Avon. Um, his birthday is most commemorated as April 23rd, and ironically, they believe that he died on the same day, in 1616. But he was the oldest of eight children. He became the oldest of eight children because his oldest sibling actually passed away. Initially, he was the second child, but his oldest sibling passed away, so that made him the oldest of eight children at a very young age, and we would consider it a young age now, but back then, um, it was pretty much commonplace to marry at this age. He married at the age of 18 a woman by the name of Anne Hathaway, who was 8 years older than he was. Um, Anne was already pregnant at the time that Shakespeare met her, and so they had three children together. The oldest of their children was born 6 months after they married, and then they had a set of twins. One twin died at 11 years old. Um, and so that was his experience. And I believe that, that may have been a genetic thing because, again, in his lineage with his parents, their oldest died, and so I'm wondering if this twin, the twin that died, was the oldest twin. Um, and so, but he was a very prolific writer. Um, Altogether, Shakespeare's works were 38 plays. He had two narrative poems. He wrote 154 sonnets and just so many other poems. So he was only 52 years old when he passed away. Um, we have his plays because people within his company, gathered his writings after he passed away. Um, Unfortunately, they only collected 36 at the time, and then over the years, others have discovered and found them, and that's why we have access to them now. But at the time of his passings, people were actors and people within the Shakespearean company took his writings and preserved them. And so that's why we have them until today. But they didn't get any of his poetry. But over the years, like I said, other historians and people found them and was able to really preserve them in a way that we now have them. And so Macbeth, again, this story is an 11th century, based off 11th century Scotland. The story itself, the play itself, is considered the Scottish play. It is Shakespeare's shortest play. It's the shortest play that he's had. They consider it a curse play. So they don't like to actually say the name of Macbeth, but if you're into superstitious things. But 11th century Scotland is pretty much what Shakespeare based this on, or where he wrote this. The scene, that's the scene um that he's set the tone in, and it was characterized by political instability, and it was a mix of Gaelic and Norse cultures, and a growing influence of the English crown. The English crown was expanding a lot, and so we got to see, you get to see a little bit, well, actually a lot of that influence throughout the play. And so there was some internal conflict with competing lords vying for power. And this is why we see the betrayal of the one uh, Thane, if you will, and that's how he, the Thane of Cardor in the play, right? And then we see the rise of the House of Dunkeld, led by kings like Malcolm III of Canmore, his son Edgar. They began to centralize power with English support because, again, English support was there because, again, it benefited the crown at the time. And so just seeing those things, helps shape the play and our understanding of all the politics that went on during this play and at the time that Macbeth was writing it. The economy was primarily based on animal farming. The country saw the first significant influence of Norman feudalism, which is a hierarchy system of land ownership and social organization. And so basically it was a pyramid of control. Obviously you have the king at the top, and then from there you have barons, knights, peasants, and that's how it goes. And so they had trade alliances with England. Please remember that Macbeth himself, King Macbeth, is and was a real person. He was born in 1005 to a ruling family. So it's not like, Shakespeare made this up. This was a real person. He really ruled. He came from a ruling family. And so he didn't just create this fictitious character, but Macbeth himself actually existed. All right. Um, and so it's important that we understand this particular premise about Shakespeare. Okay, so let's talk about Elizabethan and the Renaissance um, audience for a minute, right? They were morbidly fascinated with witches and witchcraft, which is why we see that thread and that theme within the play a lot, right? Um, so much so that they circulated little pamphlets um, about witches and witchcraft. And those little pamphlets would be the equivalent of what we would call popular newspapers today. Yes, we don't necessarily always print newspapers. Some places still do. I still see them around. So it would be the equivalent of a popular newspaper. And so that's what those pamphlets were. And I mean, they had all kinds of crazy tales about what they believed witches could do, how diabolical they were, all of the powers that they have. They believed that witches could predict the future. They believed that witches could bring night during the day. They believed that they could cause fogs and tempests. They believed that witches could kill animals. Um, they believed like a lot of these things. They believe that the witches could curse their enemies with fatal diseases. They believe that witches could cause nightmares and sterility. They also believe that witches could take demonic possession of a person, like literally take over their bodies and do things on their behalf. They believe that witches could raise evil spirits by concocting these bruises. All of these different interesting stories about witches and witchcraft, and so this is why we see that influence in Macbeth, and it starts off with them with three weird sisters, i.e., witches, performing a blood ritual. You see a thumb, you see all kinds of stuff. They're talking about it. And so you see the influence and you see where a lot of that kind of superstitious thing, those things um, were written into the play. They also believe that witches allowed the devil to suck their blood and perform other blood rituals. People believe all kinds of things, and so just it just caught on, and it was a big thing. It's important to note that almost everyone who considered to be a witch, though, in that time was a woman. It's like they didn't believe that men could be witches. And so between 1560 and 1603, hundreds of women were convicted and executed of witchcraft. And then in 1604, they actually passed a law that found anyone guilty of witchcraft would be executed. They were already doing that, but they actually made it a law in 1604. Now, how would they know if someone was a witch? Because, like, it was, how would you know? Unless you caught them in the act of doing something, right? Testing out whether or not someone was a witch. Now, I would say that some of these things would make anyone confess just to make the torture stop, but they pretty much tortured these people. Um, and I mean, they tortured these people, right? Sometimes they would just keep dunking them underwater until they confess. There was all other kinds of pain tortures. Um, some confessed because psychologically they really believed that they were witches. This is why the play has psychological implications as well. And so we can't really say that, oh, the witches were in their head. No, they were actual real characters that Shakespeare wrote into the play and actually gave them really strong prominence within the play itself. And so it's important to note this part about the play. Okay, let's get into the structure of a play as we talk about dramas. Okay, so in the structure of a play, there are acts, scenes, and lines, right? When we were talking about how to annotate a play, we annotate based off of, we have to write down the act, the scene, and the line. And how do you know the line? You have to count it. So we know we're in act one, scene two, but what are we annotating? You have to count each line so you know which line. It could be line 56, 57, however many lines, but you count down the lines down the page. And so an act is a division within a play, much like chapters of a book, right? Each act consists of several scenes Plays can have one act, two acts, or as many as five acts, right? In more contemporary plays, it's shorter. You don't have as many acts. You might have two, maybe three acts. Um, Obviously, in Elizabethan in the Renaissance period, the plays were much longer. Again, this is Macbeth is one of Shakespeare's shortest plays. But acts give plays a structure, and they help guide the audience through the story. Okay, it guides the audience through the story. So act one sets up the conflict and introduces the characters, right? And act two builds tension, raises the stakes. Hello, sounds like plot to me. And act three brings resolution to the conflict. So just like in a novel, plays have a plot. They still follow the plot structure. All of that was the plot. Act one, act two, act three, right? Obviously, the more acts, the more, the plot is stretched out, but that's pretty much the extent of how a play is structured. Now, when it comes to scene, each scene contributes to the overall story and theme of the play. And so, if we were annotating, we could break it down by scene and then obviously the lines within the scene. And so, scenes make up each act that move the audience through the story. They are used to show different locations and passages of time and gives us the audience more information about the characters and plot. In Act One, Scene Two, for instance, there were multiple characters who speak. There had five characters who had speaking parts, but there were so many other characters that were also in that scene, and so it introduced us to these other characters, but also we learned more about not only the plot but what was going on at the time. We recognized that at this time there was war going on in the land, so we learned more about the backstory, the exposition of the plot during this time. And so while each scene has a specific purpose, they all work together to create this cohesive story. Now, the transitions between scenes are important because they help the play flow smoothly, right? Just like last week, I was talking about making sure that your paragraphs transition smoothly, that you transition smoothly between paragraph to paragraph, sentence to sentence, so on and so forth. It's just as important. That's what scenes do. They help the play move forward, but they transition us very well so that nothing is actually broken and choppy. Um, and you don't want that, especially between intense or emotional scenes. You want to make sure that the audience comes along with the play and it makes sense. And so, lines or dialogue are the written or spoken conversational exchanges between two or more people within scenes in the play. Act one, scene one, we see the witches, the three witches or weird sisters, right? They're having dialogue and conversation, and so that's what we see. Act one, scene two, the five people speaking, Ross, and we see Malcolm, the king speaks, the bleeding soldier speaks. Like we see all these people having speaking lines within the play. And so it reveals to us when we see these lines, this dialogue, it reveals the character's thoughts, their feelings, reactions to what's going on in the play, or it also even drives the plot forward. So we get to see a little bit more. And so it's just like, if you were annotating, you could annotate the characterization. What are the characters thinking? How are they feeling? Are they sarcastic? Are they angry? How does this character feel? In relation to what's going on overall. And so, as performative art, because that's what theater is and that's what, plays and dramas do, theater itself often relies heavily on dialogue as a means of communication between characters. Even we have asides and soliloquies. Okay. The soliloquy The difference between an aside and a soliloquy. An aside is we see the characters speaking to themselves, so we can get an inside track of what they're thinking, but they're really talking to themselves. Whereas a soliloquy is that character talking directly to the audience. So it's pretty much we still get an inside track into that character's mind, but one is talking to themselves, and the other is the character talking to the audience. And so it's through dialogue that we see the conflict within the play, relationships. Um, and even themes are explored, right? Dramas themselves follow traditional formats of storytelling. Okay. Again, we still have exposition, conflict, rising action, conflict, the climax, falling action, and resolution. So all of those traditional parts of a plot. But and so if hopefully you can see how all of the previous lessons build up upon each other. But exposition again provides us with the backdrop. What's the backstory? What do we need to know happened before the play begins? This is why the historical context was important, and it matters so that we know what this is based on, and that gives us some perception of how we can approach reading it. Now, obviously, conflict occurs when an incident arises that begins the main action of the play. Then we have rising action, which is a series of events that escalate the action. The plot doubles down on the rising action in such a way that it just really, really just pulls it pulls it and draws us as the audience in. And so the climax is the moment of greatest tension within the story. And the following action in the play depicts the aftermath of the climax, right? What happens after Macbeth actually kills King Duncan? And then the resolution or the denouement is when the conflict is resolved or eliminated. And we see that in Act 5. So aside from the act scenes and lines, the traditional plot of a play will consist of an exposition, action leading to a climax, and a denouement or resolution. So it's just shorter than in a novel. So everything is a lot more condensed because you don't have a lot of time. This play, like I said, is the shortest. So actual run time in theater on stage is about an hour and a half. So it moves pretty quickly, and there's a lot that's covered in a short time. So a certain amount of information about characters and events are necessary at the start of the play, right? And sometimes an explanation of what has happened in the past is required so that the audience, again, we can make sense of what's going on and know how to follow along, which is why the historical context is important. And Act 1 Scene 2 is important because we learn from the bleeding soldier that there is a war going on, and an exchange between the bleeding soldier and Malcolm, and understanding that relationship dynamic helps us understand also just how the severity of the war and that's going on. Some skill is definitely necessary um, on the part of the author if the exposition is to be interesting, subtle, even natural seeming. Like it has to flow and make sense. It can't just be boom here, but it has to have good pace, tone, diction, all those things, right? But you also, the author can't hold up the action too long, or it's going to be drawn out. People will find it boring. And so, in working out the structure of a play, particularly where the acts are divided into a number of scenes, as in the way Shakespeare writes, it can be helpful to make brief summaries of the scenes. And sometimes that happens, other times it does not. And so, these summaries will not only help to clarify the action, but are later useful for revision purposes. Sometimes Shakespeare will tell us what something is, and other times he won't. And so this is one of those times where we